Today's episode of What's on Your Bookshelf is brought to you by Insignia Training Partners, the leaders in outsourced L&D talent and resources. Insignia is a full-service learning and development company that provides L&D talent to design, develop, and deploy your training solutions. Insignia specializes in providing the right resources for your projects at a fraction of the cost as opposed to bringing on new full-time employees. This includes fractional Chief Learning Officer services for enterprise training strategy, instructional designers to develop your training content and materials, facilitators to deliver in-person or virtual training to your staff, LMS administrators to manage the process, virtual training producers to make sure your virtual training is engaging and effective, and coaches to support the learning after training is completed. If you don't have a training department, that's okay. Insignia can be your bolt-on training department. With Insignia, you get dedicated resources providing fractional services by specialists in their field. Whether it's onboarding new hires, upskilling your team, or ensuring compliance, Insignia designs impactful programs that stick. Visit insigniatraining.com to discover their full range of services and to schedule a free consultation. Insignia is your partner for training success.
Welcome to What's on Your Bookshelf with your hosts, Denise Russo and Samantha Powell.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of What's on Your Bookshelf. This is the Life and Leadership podcast where we're living out loud the pages of the books on our bookshelves. My name's Denise Russo. My co-host is Sam Powell, and the book that we took off our shelves for this week is The 5 Bold Choices. It's by Coughlin and Larry Julian. We started the book a few weeks ago, so we're about midway through. Sam, I'm looking forward to talking with you today about adaptability.
Yeah, this is bold choice number 3. So we've come through a couple of these already. Last week we talked about accountability, and the week before that we talked about clarity. So getting clear, getting accountable, and now getting adaptable, which I think is, I've led a life of a lot of change and a lot of you thought the trajectory was one way, and then all of a sudden it was a very, very different way. And I think adaptability is something that is really, really important and really is something that you have to purposefully choose. So I was glad to see this one on the list and glad to see what the authors had to say about it.
Yeah, change, we often say, is the only constant in work. And so if you aren't able to maneuver yourself through changes and adapt to different changes, whether it's in your life or in your workplace, then you're either going to get left behind or not know how to move forward. So he starts out the chapter in this section talking about how topics like resilience, creativity, and organizational learning deal with stress. And it got me to thinking about how recently I've been working with this organization that's using biometric intelligence to measure a person's stress through things like their heart rate. And one of the things that I was sharing with the CEO of that company recently was when you think about measuring the health of your heart, it's more than just the physical organ inside your body. You often say, get to the heart of the matter, or it's the heart that counts, or put your heart into it. Those are the emotional things that we call our heart. And so with this chapter, I was really thinking about how when you are navigating things that you have to be adaptable to, it's one thing to say, do I know how to do it? Do I know what to do? But this is also about why would you do it and what kinds of emotions do you need to go through in your own mind and your thoughts and your beliefs before you can get to the actions and the results that you're looking for.
Yeah, definitely. And it's interesting because he goes on to say that, those things that companies often address when they're talking about learning and dealing with stress and all that good stuff is that they miss the core issue, that change is painful. Mm-hmm. And that really is the big problem, is that change is really hard and we have a huge push against it, right? It's why change management is such a big topic. But I think so often just get change management wrong. And he goes on to say, for that reason, people resist in a variety of ways, such through denial, avoidance, simply becoming comfortably numb. And I starred that comfortably numb, and he talks about that a few times because I know that throughout the arc of my career so far and life in general, there are definitely places where you become comfortably numb to problems that are going on in your life. It's it's so much harder to try to take the steps you need to take to make the moves that you really want, that you just stay in this place where it's I'm just not gonna feel it, not gonna deal with it. And I think that this is one of the things that the pandemic shoved everyone out of their comfortably numb spaces, because I think that that's what we see on the other side of all the return to work, all of the getting back to regular life. People are questioning these things that were part of standard operating protocol for all of us, right? We all drove into offices in downtown buildings for, 50 hours a week, parking and, doing all this stuff, spending hours in the car on, car, train, whatever, and commuting and things like that. And when you were shoved out of that comfortably numb space, all of a sudden, it doesn't work anymore. All of a sudden, you realize things could change. They did change. They were forced to change. So now I'm questioning what I really need and really want. And I think that those kind of big shifts where something pushes you to change, to make that, it pushes you out of that. It's like those wake-up calls, those wake-up moments that you're oh, I guess I do need to adapt. I do need to, be able to do this. And I think that, I don't know, we're forced into adaptability a lot, but what this is really getting at is that you've got to choose to be adaptable. You got to choose to change. You got to choose to go through the pain, because that's really how you're taking control of your life.
100%. It's interesting that you were sharing about how you think that where that changed was from the pandemic. And if you think back to 2 years ago, after the pandemic, well, I guess it's never really ended, but let's say after the majority of the shutdown happened, then the Great Resignation came. And the Great Resignation was a time when people had opportunity. So they didn't want to be numb and hate their job and hate their boss and hate what they did every day at work. They had options. And so they could go out and just say, I'm going to start over, or I'm going to try a new career, or this other company is going to pay me more money or give me better opportunities. But then things changed again. And the next change was silent quitting, because people were stuck, because they knew they wanted to leave where they were, but didn't have an out to get there.
Yeah.
Jobs were hard to come by. People were unsure about where their companies were headed. And then it changed again. And thousands of people lost their jobs and got laid off, especially in the tech industry, from where you and I came from. And so when that happened, I circled almost this entire page, because it said people are comfortably numb. People need to work but hate their job. They've lost their passion. They're bored with life. And it didn't just happen to baby boomers. It happened to everybody. And so last year, when we launched Your Signature Story, it was because of this sort of uncomfortable zone where people really were seeking their passions, elevating their potential, and trying to find purpose and meaning in what they did, not just, like you said, that 40-hour paycheck. And it sort of reminds me of that quote John Maxwell often says, which is, once you've tasted significance in your life, success no longer satisfies, but people are searching for that. And yet they're right now stuck. And so this chapter, I think, is a perfect timing and a perfect place as we're at the top of the new year for people to start exploring about what's going to kind of wake you up from that. What's going to move you to a place where no matter how challenging, or the book says painful, that change might be, are you going to confront it, or are you just going to stay numb and uncomfortable?
Right. Right. And I think that so often we wait around for those catalyst moments, and then it's oh man, I wish I would have made this change earlier, right? In retrospect, I was really unhappy. In retrospect, things weren't working. But in reality, you need to be really assessing more often, like, is what I'm doing, is the life that I'm living in all aspects of it serving me, right? Are the little habits that I have working for me? Are the big things working for me, right? Are my friendships, are my relationships serving the person that I am and would like to be and are becoming and all that sort of good stuff? Because only in that, like, assessing and looking ahead can you then be adaptable. And I've got a quote in here by Leon Megason that is, it's not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent, but the one most responsive to change. And I think about, like, if you look back through history, it's the people who were right on, at the right time, looking at the changes that needed to happen, right? Like the revolutions that, went into place, like industrial revolutions, right? Like automotive industries, technology industries, right? Right now we're in the middle of the AI, revolution. Like it's the people who are adapting to those changes that really survive. Those are the companies that stick around for, decades and decades and decades, are the ones that just ride the wave of change and adapt to them. And I think that we need to think about that in our personal lives too, right? The world around us changes, we change, we grow, right? We move into these different phases of life, and we've got to have that same mindset that things are adjusting whether I want them to or not. And so I've got to look at what I need to adapt, what I need to do to make this next phase work for me, right? And change the little things as I go along that, I realize don't work.
People will say things like, well, that company needs to change, or that government needs to change. What runs the companies and the government are the people. And until leaders are willing to have change leadership, not just change management, or not just going with the flow, or not looking backward and not being willing to move forward, then these are problems that companies face. In fact, this morning, there's a leader, a very senior leader that kind of took you and me under his wing and was really helping us to overcome barriers and present ideas that were rock the boat revolutionary in some ways. And he was a champion for what we were doing. And at that time in our career, I thought, you know what? We're going to really make a change here. We're going to make a difference. And this is going to be really transformational. We have this great person backing us up. And then along the way, all three of us left the organization that we were part of. And today, this person had announced that they've now taken on a new job. And it's been a couple years and has taken on a new job. And I was reading some of the comments of people that were kind of celebrating this new job for him. And they're like, oh man, the new company's so lucky to have you. And oh, you're going to be amazing there. And oh, this is such great news for you. But I almost paused for a moment and thought to myself, no, the old company was lucky to have you. The old company should have celebrated those things in you. The old company maybe should have been willing to kind of move through those uncomfortable times of transformation into something better. But yet again, we all are faced sometimes with change, even if it's not in our own choices. And so when the chapter transitions from talking about how you got to get out of your uncomfortable zone, they said the way to do it, which is where you and I have spent a good majority of our career, whether as coaches or learning and development professionals or operational executives, which is that this author talked about having an insatiable appetite for knowledge, and that continuous learning is how he helped change the way that he navigated his life. And the last little piece about that I want to share before I take a breath is that it's one thing to learn something out of a book and have knowledge, but it is a separate and different complementary thing to gain wisdom. And so when you are aligned with people who are wise, not just smart, you'll be able to navigate things like change. And so that was just something that was on my mind as I was reading this part of the chapter. I circled that same quote that you had as well from the beginning of this chapter.
Yeah, and I like the difference between like knowledge and wisdom, right? Because wisdom feels like always takes it a step further of not only have I learned the thing, but I've experienced the thing, I've done something with the thing. And so now my knowledge is so much stickier, so much deeper, so much more, useful really at the end of the day. And they do address too that like when you're facing changes, when you're facing things like that can feel overwhelming. Like the whole thing change is painful, right? And nobody likes it. And one of the things that I highlighted too in this section was that, if I looked at the obstacles stacked on top of each other, they would have been too overwhelming to overcome. So I adapted by chunking them and focusing them on one problem at a time. And I found that to be so very true. Like go out and learn and gain the wisdom and do the things that you need, but also couple that with breaking things down into smaller problems. Like this is something I do with people who are finally like they have some moment and they realize they got to get out of their job that they're in and they want something different. And so it's like, well, I want to find a new job. And it's like, okay, well, here's all the chunks we got to break down, right? We need to get your branding updated. Who are you? Who are you trying to be, right? What's your resume need to look like? How does that carry over to like your online, branding and presence and profiles? And then, then it's interviewing and negotiation and all that kind of stuff. It's like, what are all the pieces that break it down? Because finding a new job feels so overwhelming. And so we stay stuck where we don't want to be. And in reality, we could get out, we could make these changes. We just need to chunk things down into smaller bits and smaller problems and, and things like that. And so I think that like when you're feeling overwhelmed or like, oh my gosh, how am I supposed to adapt to this? Or, the AI revolution like feels so overwhelming. It's like, well, what's the first thing you could do? Right. And then just what's the next step and the next step? And before you know, you've gained a lot of knowledge. And then as you apply, you gain the wisdom with it too. And that's really where the adaptability comes from. It's that ability, I think, to, break things down, to just go after, go try, go do, go take the steps, go do the learning, to really get you there.
The thing about it is if you want to have something different, you need to do something different, because if you keep doing the same things you've always done, then you're always going to have the things that you've always had. And so it may be in your life that you have something dramatic happen. You're laid off from a job, or in the case of the book, you have a car accident and kill someone and are facing prison time. He also mentions in this chapter about how the world changed on 9/11, which is super interesting that it came in this chapter, because we've shared with you as listeners that we record these episodes in advance, and today is actually 9/11. And so I was thinking this morning about what that day was like for me. I didn't go into work thinking that there was going to be a massive change. At that time, I was working for Planet Hollywood and I was over sales and marketing, which later had absolutely zero to do with my next career and the one after that and where I am today. And so I was in this building. I had the greatest manager. I just love Steve. He was my manager, one of my top 5 favorite managers. And we were just getting ready for the day like normal. But in an instant, life can change, whether it changes at work or whether it changes in your personal life, things change. And if you aren't able to change along with it, you can become very paralyzed by that. Even fast forward to today, 23 years later, we have seen some of our clients, yours and mine, that are struggling with the change to be adaptable to a new way of life after leaving work. And I recall very shortly after you and I left our jobs 2 years ago that we discussed about things like, well, what do we want our future to look like? You can't sit back in the past. You can sit back there for a little while and get your feelings out, but now you have to move forward. And so in this bottom line of this particular chapter, he talks about how adaptability was really the keys to his success as he was looking at what were the bold choices that made the difference in his life. And so one of the areas I highlighted, which comes at the end of the second part of this chapter, was that adapting to change and continuous learning are 2 critical elements that will help you persevere through life's roller coasters of ups and downs, because you're either going forward or you're falling backward. And so when I was highlighting that, I thought to myself, are we ever at a standstill, or is it true that either you're moving forward or you're going backward?
Yeah, I don't know. That's an interesting question, because I've met plenty of people and talked to plenty of people and experienced in my own life plenty of times where I felt stuck, where it felt stagnant, right? Like it's like comfortably numb, but also like comfortably frozen, right? Like of not moving forward. But if you think, like, if you zoom out of just yourself in that, the world keeps spinning, the world keeps moving. So like while you may personally be feeling like you're stagnant, you're probably in reality actually just falling behind because you're wasting the time you've got in this world, right? You're wasting the moments of your life. So yeah, you could have a year-long period where nothing changes for you. You do the same thing day in, day out. You don't really progress, you don't really move forward, you're just stuck. But guess what? The world moved forward a whole year. The people around you, the people in your community, in the broader, space have moved forward. And so now you kind of are left behind. It's like by taking no action, you sort of are moving backwards. So I don't know. I could see that being very true. I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about that in that way, but yeah, I think I buy into that.
Yeah. Well, here's a really introspective exercise that anyone listening can do that he ends this part of this chapter with, which is he says, think back over the last 5 years. How much have you adapted professionally? How much have you adapted personally? I highlighted that because I was like, wow, I don't always take the time to do a look back, but I did when I was reading this chapter, and I thought, wow, 5 years ago, 5 years ago, my life was far different. My kids were in high school. I was 3 jobs back from where I am today. I was doing something different, lived in a different house. Things were different for me 5 years ago. I didn't necessarily know where I would be today. I had plans to move myself toward where I am today, but this may be something that you listening can really take some time to think about. What was your life like 5 years ago? I just mentioned a story that I remember like that from 23 years ago. I can't remember what I ate for dinner last night. So those things that are impactful in our lives are going to be at the forefront of our mind. So if you think about that backwards, then maybe think about, what do you want your life to be like 5 years from now? For me, I know 5 years from now will be much different than it is today, only because if I look backwards, I could see how much different it was before.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that in that retrospection, we really get the opportunity to recognize how much personal growth we've had, right? Like how much things have adjusted and changed. Like just over the last week, I'm doing, right, we recorded this in advance. I'm doing all this prep for like a parental leave, having a baby and, going out and all this sort of stuff. But it's been prepping our personal life, prepping, my business and all this sort of good stuff. So I had this conversation with my business coach last week about really looking ahead to where I want to pick up when I come back from this leave, right? Like, what does that look like? So what are the things, I need to be thinking about? What are the notes for myself that's like, hey, dear Sam, welcome to post leave. Here's the stuff you wanted to do, right? Here's the ideas that you had. But like to get to that place, I had to look back at the journey of everything that I've done over the last year and a half, really. And that was such an interesting journey of like, I really did learn a lot. I really did grow a lot in that space. And my husband and I just yesterday did the same thing with our finances. I mean, if anybody who knows me, I'm like a spreadsheet like person. So of course I have this very complex like financial spreadsheet where we track, everything down to like our net worth down to the penny, just because we can. And I like to be that level of organized with everything. But even just seeing like, when you look back on that, we've been doing this for years at this point, even looking back at like the growth and the decisions we've made, right? The complexities that have come into what used to be 2 kids in their 20s who had spend in a save account and that was it, to, people who are, close to 40 and now have, a full portfolio, and thinking about the things that we've done different and thinking about, well, what are the things that we want to be doing different as we move forward too? And like just that retrospection and that time to reflect and look back really does make you realize like how much growth we need to do. And this next part of this chapter really talks about how transformation comes from the inside out. And so with these changes, right, with these things that I've been looking back on, I realized how much I've changed, right? My knowledge on certain topics, my wisdom in a lot of spaces, my relationship with money, with business, with being an entrepreneur, all that kind of stuff has really shifted. Mm-hmm. And so it's not just that the things and the actions have changed, it's that I personally have had to grow and couldn't get where we are today, where I am today, without having these big shifts in how I look at the world, how I think about things, what I plan for, what I think about. And I think that's when they moved on from, where we were talking in this chapter to this transformation really comes from the inside out. I think that's one of the most true statements I've ever really read and have really thought about, is that, if you want change in your life, you have to start inside of yourself first and foremost, which is one of your big things. You talk about this all the time. And, when we think about, right, and this is in the context of adaptability, when we think about that, right, to be adaptable, you personally have to be willing to grow and to make changes.
100%. I put stars and highlights all around this one very short, simple sentence that he had here, which is that personal transformation precedes practical application. Mm-hmm. I live my life in a pretty practical way, a fact-oriented way, a task-oriented way, but everything that we do from the perspective of being coaches and leadership development experts and trainers comes from personal transformation. In fact, I think often about how some companies focus on manager training, but they don't focus on leadership development or true talent development. Development means that something has to go through a continual cycle of change and evolution towards something greater. And for me, the best way that I've been able to navigate my own journey is with a coach. I am a coach, Sam is a coach, but we both have coaches. And you just talked about your business coach. And I think it's important for the listeners that are online with us to know that whether you are a coach or not is not the point. It's that every one of us can benefit from having a coach. In fact, the author says that don't let your fears, biases, and skill sets stop you from adapting and growing in every season. Life is short. Adapt and enjoy the ride. But so often it's very difficult to figure out, how do I adapt? You have all the answers inside of you. That's the premise of coaching, is that a coach is there to draw out those things from inside of you. And so I think it's important just to say that it's one thing to learn the skills or to read a book. We've read these books. We're telling you how we're living out loud the books. We're sharing with you our personal stories from the books. But if you don't personally change, there won't be change. In fact, this morning, somebody put a comment on my LinkedIn post, since we were announcing a new episode coming out, because every Wednesday we have new episodes. And the person was saying something, it was a topic of happiness, which was our last book. And the person said, well, how do you create better habits for happiness? And I kind of thought to myself, well, you must have missed the year before. We went through, 14 episodes.
We got you. Just go back and listen.
So go back. We've got 14 chances for you to learn how to create better habits. And so again, when we take this look back and the move forward, I just want a summation about what we've gone through. We went through how to look at passion, potential, and purpose in your personal ikigai, which is finding the center of your purpose. We moved into how to navigate your own personal heart set and your mindset through the lessons from John Wooden. We then transitioned into how to build better habits and break bad ones with James Clear and Atomic Habits. We spent an entire year on the topic of happiness and how to not just find happiness, but how to be happier than you already are. We went through several books with that, as well as ending the year on how to live a life with intention and purpose and meaning with John Maxwell through intentional living. So here we are transforming again. We've started out this new year talking about there are choices now that we have to make. We've given you the knowledge. Now it's sharing our wisdom from our own scenarios and our own reading through and living out loud the pages on these books so that you can take all of that yourself to live this life. One thing to keep in mind as well, I was mentioning this episode that came out today on my LinkedIn. Remember, this is likely January, if maybe February that we're in right now. Go back to the last book we did, The Happiness Project, because if you remember, if you listened to those episodes, which we did them in succession of the chapters, they are done in 12 episodes of 12 months of the year. And the very first one had everything to do with even what we're learning about today, which is sometimes you have to clear out the clutter, whether the clutter is in your mind or in your heart or in your business or on your desk, so that you can make space for doing these practical things that we're learning in this book about these choices. And that while these practical skills are essential, the author says that his primary focus was on developing his personal character. So it's really important as you listen to these episodes that there are these 2 points, these two pillars, knowledge and wisdom, the practical application and the personal character and values that we hold inside of our hearts.
Yeah. I completely agree. And I think that, speaking of like the habits, this really comes down to, right? The authors here are really encouraging us to make bold choices. And what we're talking about here is adaptability. Make the choice day in and day out to be adaptable. But one of the ways you have to do that is by working on yourself. And it reminds me of the James Clear quote from Atomic Habits, where he talks about building identity-based habits, right? Who am I wanting to be? Who am I and who am I wanting to be? And what actions does that person take, right? If I want to be a writer writes. Well, what else do they do? What does that look like? And how do I build these little movements? And that's the adaptability thing, I think, is that you can layer these things on top of each other, of these real practical ways to become an adaptable person. You can build adaptability habits, essentially, of maybe it's through reflection, maybe it's through, looking ahead, maybe it's through reading article once a week on a topic that you're trying to, embrace or something like that. But it's really those little things that you do, but it's got to be centered around who are you wanting to be? Who are you wanting to become? And what are the actions that really go along with that to make that happen? And they talk too that, in this chapter, as it sort of wraps up, they're saying that there's no better training ground for character than the trials in life. And peace is not the absence of conflict and storms, but the presence of the calm within the storm. And I think that we learned that a lot through our year of happiness is not the absence of trials and tribulations. It is the peace and the calm and the centering that you can do inside of that, right? It's the actions that you take. It's the choices, the bold choices that you make that help you and guide you towards the life that you want to live and the person you want to be.
Absolutely. I think another thing you can do, another exercise that's in this chapter as he closes out this part, is to change your thinking. If you can change your mind, you can change your life. And one of the things he says is he quotes something that someone wrote thousands of years ago, which is so simple, and yet we just don't apply it in our life. And so what he said was, or what he quoted was, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, right, pure, lovely, and admirable. If anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about those things. So if you're stuck today and you're thinking about anything other than those things, you have a choice into the way that you think. And so he transitions that into the next part of the chapter, which ends this section of this piece on adaptability by talking about if you change yourself, you will change your destiny. But your destiny isn't going to change if you don't change. And so I think that it's one thing to have dreams in life, but if you don't do anything with your dreams, then they're just in your head.
Right. Yep, I completely agree. It's that moving into action that you really need to do. And when it comes down to adaptability, that's exactly it, right? It's taking the action given the circumstances, given the situation, and moving forward with it in a way that serves you.
Yeah. So, Sam, what are we going to talk about next week? Because we're out of time for today.
Next week is confidence, which some of us are overconfident, some of us are underconfident, and we all sort of tend to fluctuate between the two. But they have a really interesting take and definition on confidence. So I'm excited to talk about that next week with you.
Yeah, I'm always looking forward to being with you. So for today, friends, my name is Denise Russo, and on behalf of my friend Sam Powell, thanks for joining us on another episode of What's on Your Bookshelf.